Hey everyone, how's it going today? Today, if you've been keeping up, we're going to start really digging into our Homelab. Today we're going to be doing your first virtual machine. We're going to keep it relatively basic. We're only going to be installing a Windows operating system, which you may have done before, either physically, using a disk or like a USB drive. Today we're going to be doing it via WDS from my other server, just to kind of like expose you to that. And then we're going to be working with the various virtual machine configurations. As always, I'll leave a description with like important links that I think you might find interesting, or if you want to, dig deeper into a specific option that I just kind of like go over. So without further ado, let's get started. We're on our lab server again today, obviously. So once you bring up your Hyper-V console, we're just going to head over here to a new. And remember, and I think like the last video, we already created our network interfaces, and we're going to hit New Virtual Machine. So you can read through this. This is basically just the virtual machine wizard, and it's just going to guide us through, creating it and setting up our initial configurations. A lot of this stuff can be changed later, so if you make a mistake or you can't go back, don't think that it's totally gone. We'll go ahead and hit next here, and we'll just call this one Windows 10. And we don't care if it's in the default location, so we'll go ahead and leave it as is. Next. Alright, so Generation 1 and Generation 2. This is basically, for lack of a better term, Legacy Boot or CSM versus UEFI. So we can have our legacy one, or we can use UEFI with Secure Boot for our Gen 2. Most popular Linux distributions like Ubuntu, Debian, I think, Mint, I also think, they actually do support UEFI. I'll show you how to configure that in a second. But BSD, at least the current release, which is I think 11. Does not like Generation 2. And regardless of whether or not you can shut off the Secure Boot feature, which you can in Generation 2 virtual machines, BSD can't see the NICs, the interface, the network cards. I don't really know why. I think you can actually bypass it using drivers after you like load into it. But if you don't want it to be a pain, select Gen 1 if you're on BSD, otherwise you can select Gen 2. Since this is Windows 10, we're going to be using Gen 2. So we'll use Generation 2, and we'll hit Next. This is the startup memory type. So basically this is going to be the amount of memory that the machine initially boots with, not the minimum amount of RAM. That's a little bit different. This is going to be just for like pre-environments. Leaving this at a gig is generally good. We're going to enable dynamic memory, and what dynamic memory means is other than and including the startup memory, which is a gig, which you need for like the PE environment that installs Windows or like Linux. Dynamic memory, when it's enabled, allows the machine to, I think the base threshold is 512 megs, and up to as much as memory as you want, really. It allows the memory to scale. So instead of a machine being assigned 4 gigabytes of memory, you can enable dynamic memory, and if it needs 3 gigs at some point because it's doing a task that's really heavy, the Hyper-V will provision it, the 3 gigs plus some, so that it can that way it can work. And then when Hyper-V realizes that the memory usage has gone down, it will take back some of that memory. And the task manager in Windows operating systems anyway will actually reflect that. It'll say, hey, yeah, I only have 2 gigs total now, whereas a half an hour ago when I was running this huge file operation, I had like 4 total. So that's pretty neat. It also makes sure that your resource consumption is balanced all the time, and we can get into that more later. I'll throw a link for all that stuff down below. So we'll go ahead and hit Next. We have the base gig that we're going to want. Anything less than like a gig generally doesn't tend to mess up any of the Linux installs. probably if you dipped below like 512 megs, I don't even know if it'll actually let you do that. Yeah, 32 is the low for this. But a gig though is what you need for like the Windows installs, or else it like will not work. So we'll go ahead and use dynamic memory and hit next. And we're going to go ahead and let this connect to the primary network, my main network, because I'm going to want to pixie boot again off of my other server. So here we get to, you know, define our hard drive, our virtual hard drive, our VHDX. VHDs are a set size that cannot be adjusted. VHDX is the new type of drive that back in the day wasn't compatible with all operating systems, but now it pretty much is. VHDX can expand. It can get bigger, so it will only utilize, you know, the space that it has. So say you provision 127 gigs in this example, you provision 127 gigs to our Windows install, but it's just going to be a test operating system. You know, we're not installing a bunch of stuff to it. It's probably going to only use like 20 gigs or so, you know, so you're wasting 107 gigs, right, with a VHD because it's reserving all of that space. But VHDXs start at a base amount. Well, actually, no, they do. They start at a base amount. I don't know exactly what it is, but it'll expand as space is used. So it allows it to be the smallest that it possibly can be at any given time. But it does need, this basically is saying how big the disk is to the operating systems that are going to install to it. And I think Windows, I think the minimum is like 20, so we'll just do 20 to save space off the bat. And obviously you also have the choices of using a drive that you already have or attaching a drive later, so we don't need to even do this step. We're just going to hit next because we do want a drive and we do want it to be 20 gigs, and go. Alright, so here's the cool part. This is where we can install an OS later, or we can install using, you know, a bootable file like an ISO, and we would just browse for that here. Or in our case, we're going to install an operating system from a network-based installation server, which I have on my other machine. So we'll hit next, and then we'll hit finish. So it's going to configure and build that configuration file for us that defines all the settings for this virtual machine. And now you have it. You have virtual machine. You have created your first virtual machine, but we're not done yet. We have to dig into it, and I'm going to run over a couple of options and configuration settings in it, and then we'll get to installing our operating system so you can see what it does. So we'll go ahead and right click on it and hit settings, and here you are. This is the meat. This is all the cool stuff that you get to touch when you have a virtual machine. You can add various hardware, like a second network adapter or a different hard drive if you'd like. We can also touch the firmware. We can change the boot order here. We can tell this to go up, or you know, that to go down. You know what I mean? Like we can rearrange it. Secure boot. Okay, so secure boot. I will leave a link for that. I don't think it's a good idea to dive into this right away. We're going to leave this enabled. The only thing you need to know is that if you are running a Gen 2 virtual machine and you would like Secure Boot enabled, and you are using an operating system that does support it, like Ubuntu, what you want to do is you want to go here to Template, click on it, and you want to hit Microsoft UEFI Certificate Authority instead of Microsoft Windows. If you keep it on the default of Microsoft Windows and you try to install Ubuntu, it isn't going to work, and you're going to get frustrated. Because from my understanding, and I haven't dived too much into the specifics of the Microsoft Windows template, is that is specific for Windows virtual machines, whereas this is anything that has simply been signed by Microsoft is an allowed UEFI driver. So we're going to go ahead and leave that on Microsoft Windows because we will be installing a Windows OS. The next is Enable Trusted Platform Module. A TPM is basically a cryptographic chip that is either soldered onto the board and comes with it, or you can buy them separately if your board has a header that you can plug it into. And it creates a key that allows you to encrypt parts of the machine. It allows you to encrypt the hard drive based off of that key, and that key is generated based off of parts in your computer. TPMs are cool. I use one on this machine actually, and on my servers I have TPMs enabled, and this just allows you to use that same TPM that is on that physical host machine to encrypt your virtual machines. We're not going to do that right now. BitLocker and things like that are something that I'll cover later in the series. We're literally just starting with virtual machines today, so that's a bit much. The next is Enable Shielding. Again, that is something that is specific to virtual machines in the host, and something that I will get to later. Right now, you don't really need to touch that. All of this is pretty basic so far. Next would be memory. So memory, this is what I was talking about. With dynamic memory enabled, the minimum amount of RAM is 512, and the maximum amount is like something like 104 gigs or something. And the memory buffer is 20%. And then you have the weight system. So you can read the descriptions. If they're not clear enough for you, again, I'll have the documentation for this specifically. But basically, this is like priority stuff. The memory buffer and the memory weight specifically, I think the memory buffer is just reserve memory, where the memory weight is priority based, so that if it's in contention with the host machine or other virtual machines and physical RAM resources are running low, then the memory weight will allow the machine to more intelligently designate resources to the virtual machine that actually needs it. We're not going to play with needing that to be, anything but default for right now, and you don't have to either. Next is processor. This is important because this is something I do actually want to touch on really quick. It is a complicated subject. It is something that is a video all in itself. I'll just run through it though. Number of virtual processors 1. You should not and do not assume that this represents a physical core on the physical processor on the physical machine. That is not how this works. A lot of old system administrators and a lot of older technicians that worked with virtual machines when it was a young technology would do it like that, and you can still do it like that, but it's important that you understand fundamentally how it works so that you can get the most out of your machine, or else you are seriously wasting resources. If there's any quick hint that I can give you when it comes to running virtual machines and servers, it is that your memory consumption, RAM is everything. I mean, you are going to use far more RAM. You're going to run out of RAM before you run out of CPU processing power to power all those virtual machines. So with that in mind, I'm going to go ahead and assign this to, because I want it to go a little quick, and I will actually do the startup RAM as 2 gigs with the minimum amount of RAM is 2 gigs, and I'll leave the virtual processors at 2, and again I'll get to that later. The next is our management section. Pretty much, what are you naming it? Do you want a description for it? Integration services, I'm going to want you to stop here regardless of what operating system you're going to be running, mostly because some Linux operating systems also support it, and I want you to check the box guest services. Okay, that's going to enable better statistics and control of the virtual machine, and the little tabs down here, like memory, network, replication, and also commands and that you can send via PowerShell to the virtual machine. So the next is checkpoints. Checkpoints are a fantastic utility for the people that understand how to use them, and the bane of existence for people that don't understand exactly what they do. Checkpoints shouldn't be used on a basis so frequent that you think it is a backup. Checkpoints are not a backup system. Checkpoints are a safety net, and checkpoints can utilize a ton of space if you don't keep them in check. For this, we're going to disable it, and until we go over this in a later video or you read the documentation that I'll provide you, you should disable this. Next is smart paging. That doesn't matter. This is all the default stuff that we set in previous videos. Automatic start option. This tells the host machine what to do with this virtual machine should the physical machine reboot or lose power. Automatically start if it was running when the service stopped. That's the default. This is just a test operating system. This isn't production, and we're not going to be running it all the time, so I'm going to switch this to nothing. I don't want it to automatically start because I don't want it to use resources because I'm not going to always use it. And anytime you start up a test virtual machine, I suggest you do the same. I do want to touch really quick though on the startup delay. This is important when you're running multiple virtual machines, or you have virtual machines that are interlinked in some way, like you have an application here that relies on the database of this one, right? Well, what happens if the virtual machine that runs the application is faster because it doesn't need to load the database software? It's going to boot first, and then it's not going to be able to communicate with the database, and your application might crash. This helps that. You can set the startup delay, so I can say 30 seconds, right? And then if I had another virtual machine, I could set that to 0, or I could set it to 15, and that machine would start up first. It'd start up 15 or 30 seconds before this virtual machine would be started. So that's there to curb problems like that. And the next is automatic stop action. When the physical computer shuts down, what do you want us to do with this virtual machine if it's running? We can save the virtual machine state, which is like a snapshot of what's going on, turn off the virtual machine, which is like unplugging the power cord, or shut down the guest operating system. I always shut down the guest operating system because it's always good practice to make sure that your virtual machine shut down cleanly regardless of what's happening in your physical environment. And sometimes that is also reliant on guest services, which is another reason why I always want you to check that box. So we'll go ahead and hit apply now to make sure that these settings stick, and we're good to go. So let's dig right in. So we're going to right click on it here, and we're going to hit connect, and that's going to bring up our console. Here's our console. Basically, we're staring at a blank monitor. This is a computer that hasn't been powered on yet, and you're staring at the screen. So if you go ahead and hit start now, it's going to boot up and go through Hyper-V's BIOS. And right now it's doing a network boot because I set it to boot from the network, and the network card was the first boot choice. So you're actually seeing what is on my other server right now. We're going to hit enter to install Windows, and you can see it loading the boot images down there at the bottom. One thing that I just want to quickly note, and we'll get into this later, is Pixie is super cool and Pixie's super fast, and if you're making a Homelab, you should totally do it. This particular instance is run off of WDS, or Windows Deployment Services, but there are other open source tools like Fog that also do Pixie serving, that are also Pixie servers that will allow you to do this kind of stuff. So I am just going to enter in some of the information here. Hey everyone, sorry about that. We're back here. I literally had an issue with my keyboard. So if we go back here, we can now log into our server. So we'll go ahead and do that. When you do have Pixie or a WDS service, and I think Fog does it too, you need to log in to be able to access this stuff. So after we log in, we'll have access to all the images that we can install. We're going to go ahead and install Windows 10 Enterprise here, and we're going to hit Next, which will bring us to our disk disk control here, and that's it. That's our 20 gig disk that we picked out. We'll go ahead. Oh, actually, I want to show you something really quick. So this, you can see where it says that it's a 20 gigabyte disk, and you remember that we did that when we were setting up the Hyper-V. So if we actually go into Hyper-V, then we look at the VHD, it's 36 megs. So you see what I mean? It's reporting that it's a certain size, but in reality, it's going to expand dynamically, which is what we want. So that is technically, as of right now, not using anywhere near 20 gigs. So go ahead and hit Next, so it automatically formats it. And depending on how long this takes, I might pause it here. But generally, Pixie is pretty fast, so I might just make you, struggle through it. What I really want to show you after the operating system is actually installed, we actually got through all of the hard stuff when we were configuring the virtual machine. After we initially created it and we went into settings and actually did the configuration of the virtual machine itself, that was pretty much like the hardest part. The only thing that I want to show you now is that after Windows is installed, I want you to understand and see the importance of the integrations like guest services. And I want to go back to like episode 2 when I was talking about enhanced session modes. That's something that I want to show you because it drastically improves like the user experience, and maybe you'll kind of get a feel for remote FX and the things that we kind of briefly touched on in the previous episode, because that kind of stuff comes out in to play when we're using enhanced session mode, which is available after the operating system is installed. Right now this is just normal mode. And enhanced session mode happens, after the OS boots, because it actually uses drivers that are provided by Hyper-V to be able to utilize extra features that Hyper-V has to offer. One of which being, some of the things that we talked about, like in the previous episode, like remote FX. But more importantly, it'll then allow the hardware pass-through for things like graphics. And it'll really, play a huge part in like your remote administration experience if you utilize or have the opportunity to utilize enhanced session mode. So as we can see now, this is like cruising right along. Pixie is super fast, and if you ever have an opportunity to set it up either in your house or at work, or you want to like get with network administration, system administrators at your current, job, to take a look at their Pixie infrastructure or have one of them like train you on it, I definitely recommend it. It is far faster than disk and a lot faster than USB. I remember when USB was, the bee's knees, and that was super awesome, and that's what you had to use, and using a disk, other than USB was a terrible choice because, it was ridiculous. The speed difference between actual Pixie booting, PXE, it's restarting, so we're just going to go ahead and help it out. The difference between, USB and like Pixie is like ridiculous if you have like a properly configured network. We just installed Windows in like less than 5 minutes. It's kind of ridiculous. So this is going to bring us through the normal OOBE of the consumer operating systems. If you remember when we installed Server, it was pretty quick and easy. This is a full-fledged, normal operating system, so we're going to get all the goodies, that normal users get when they get to install an operating system, all the dumb questions, and you'll get to see that here. We're actually installing the Enterprise Edition of Windows 10 because it's a trial, and all of this stuff you can trial. Like you can build your entire Homelab off of like trials. It's ridiculous. So it'll have a couple of different screens because it is the trial, but it includes all like the normal screens that a normal user would have to go through. So it's basically the same experience. This should hopefully be done here in like the next couple of seconds. It doesn't generally take long to get ready on a virtual machine. Oh, there we go. Should be doing its final boot. I'm actually a bit cold today. I'm going to sip my coffee. Sorry about that. Alright. Oh. We can do a coffee check. Literally just says meh. That's the attitude you want, especially when you're breaking things in your Homelab. Alright, so remember what we talked about when we installed server? Time zones. Get them right, do it right. So we're going to go find our time zone, Eastern Time, hit next. Do you want to accept the ULA? Promise I read all of it. Alright. Get going fast. Use express settings. Get all my data. Just a moment while we collect your firstborn. I'm just kidding. I don't really believe that. Some people are really against that, and I have nothing against that either. You can just hit customize there and like switch off telemetry and things like that. We want to join a local domain. This is a question that normal users do not get. This is specific to Pro and Enterprise. We're going to hit local domain because if I do Azure, it's going to ask me a bunch of stuff. So we're going to hit next. What is your name? Test. What is your password? Password. Re-enter your password. Password. What is your password? Hint. Genie. Alright. Next. Hey, Cortana. Yeah, sure, bother me. All you want. Alright, hopefully it doesn't have a ton of updates that it needs to do. It looks like it should get us in here pretty quick, though. This is where the cool stuff happens. This is, oh no, it's getting updates! So, basically what'll happen is, assuming that your image doesn't need a million updates like mine apparently does, when it finally gets into the operating system, you're going to be able to use enhanced session mode, and you can actually access that via the virtual machine toolbar at the top. So let me go over that actually really quick. Right here is enhanced session mode. That will light up and you're going to be allowed to use it. And then we have like a couple of more tools going on here. Revert, that's for checkpoints. That's for creating checkpoints if they're enabled. They're not, so these are always going to be grayed out. We have reset, which is like the equivalent of hitting the reset button on the front of your case. Pause, which is like a hibernation. Then we have save, which is like a sleep, shut down, and then turn off, which is like unplugging it from the wall, but shutdown is more like a graceful shutdown, like ACPI when you hit start and shut down. Control Alt Delete, obviously we all know what that does. And then of course all the menus at the top will give you things like zoom level, the clipboard text. You can insert your drives here. We don't have a DVD drive attached to this, but you would be able to go into media and like, you know, insert discs and things like that. Action is pretty much the same things that are on the pip bar, because I think you can actually, wow, pip bar, sorry. Action are the same things, because I actually believe that you can shut this off. And file just allows you to modify the settings. We can hop in that real quick, because as you'll see, some of this stuff cannot be modified while the machine is running, and it tells you that at the bottom. So now that we are in our operating system, we can see that we have the Windows 10 Enterprise Evaluation, Windows license valid for 90 days. If we were to do all of our updates, and it's still downloading everything right now, but assuming this wasn't super out of date, and it might be really out of date, let's actually take a look here. I think we're on like 1809 or something right now. So if we go to system and about, we will see that we are on 1607. Yikes. Okay, so this might not actually update in time for the video here, but I will do my best here. Let's see. Anyway, this is pretty cool, right? Like this is it. You're done. Give me updates. Blah blah blah. Choose how updates are delivered. Other PCs on my network. Back. Check. And then we can go ahead and exit it. And I wonder if I reconnect, will it let me do it? No, not yet. It doesn't have the drivers. That's unfortunate. It needs to install the Hyper-V drivers, but it's so out of date that it didn't get that during the installation like it normally would. That's my bad, because I actually installed an older version of the older build of the operating system, so it has a lot more catching up that it needs to do. But generally, almost immediately after opening the session, the enhanced session mode would be enabled, and we'd be able to click on that. And basically what that's going to do is improve the resolution and the ability for it to expand. Like if we expand it right now, you see how it's just like a little square, like 800 by 600. With enhanced session mode, you'll be able to do things like copy something from the host machine or your machine if you're RDP'd into it, and like paste it over. Like it enables a bunch of really cool things, and it, like I said, it also like allows better 3D drivers and access to more hardware resources when enhanced session mode is enabled. So you get a way better experience, like you're sitting in front of the screen, as opposed to like noticeably remoted into a remote machine. So I'm gonna pause the video right here, and we'll actually get right back to this. I'm actually gonna let this update for you, and then I just want to play around with enhanced session mode a little bit after it's complete. So we will see you when I get back here. Hey everyone, welcome back. So after pretty much 600 years, it did the updates that were necessary for it to understand enhanced session mode, and we can actually see that right here on the screen now that it's actually booted up. You can see that when it boots up, we're prompted with what resolution we want. In this case, I'm going to go ahead and leave it 1366 by 768, which I think it recommends if you have a 1080p screen or higher. And we're going to go ahead and hit connect. And then you can see here where we can switch back to a basic session. This icon is now available. So for test, we did password, I think. Oh no. Gotta capitalize it. And it'll log us right in. And one of the cool features about enhanced session mode is, as you can see, not only can we now support widescreen resolutions, but we can also, the machine just runs better. We can also live scale it. So if we go ahead and hit the maximize button on the window here, we can see them. Now all of a sudden we can drag the bar over, and you can see that this is the actual Windows 10 virtual machine, and it's not taking up the entire monitor, and it scales absolutely perfect. So these are just, as I had mentioned previously, a couple of the benefits to running enhanced session mode. And we can switch back to basic. I'll go ahead and show you that really quick. So basic session, it'll reconnect us. It'll lock the screen every time it does it, by the way. We'll hit Control or Delete. And as you can see, it's definitely the 800 by 600 resolution, and we'll go ahead and log in for you. It's just as if we had just installed it, but now, like I said, it did install some of the drivers, so we can actually go back to enhanced session mode. So we'll go ahead and hit that now, and it will swap right back over. That's just a couple of the capabilities of like enhanced session mode. Like I said, if there was a graphics card that could be utilized at this point, we would be able to do better 3D acceleration on this using the built-in, the standalone graphics card with remote FX enabled. I do not have one installed on this particular server, so we won't be able to demonstrate that right now, and that would have to be another episode anyway. But now that that is done, I just wanted to show that to you guys. You successfully got your first virtual machine up and running and configured correctly with everything moving right along. It acts and works just like a normal computer. You can install any software that you'd like at this point. You could, like I said, I think in a previous one, you could make like a jump box with it and enable RDP so that you could RDP into this box and then RDP into other things on like your LAN. That's pretty much it. If you have any questions or comments, go ahead and leave them below. I'll try and splice this video up to get rid of some of the earlier mistakes as best as possible. Get at me if you have any questions. Have a good one.